know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous. A crisis without equal on Earth. The most profound collision of conscience, conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far. Where you see ideals, I see what is human. Alas, all too human.
These are the words of the visionary German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. The crisis he is predicting was the crisis of religious faith that would sweep through Europe in the late 19th century. Nietzsche was the first thinker to realize that the death of God would give birth to something entirely new in human history. The idea of absolute freedom, of man as the sole measure of the universe. What he was describing was nothing less than the birth pangs of the modern world.
That's all we need from that little documentary. All right, so I actually dug up a quotation from the early Nietzsche that's kind of on point. It's not from our reading for today, it's much earlier. It's earlier than what we read last week. So he says, as soon as it becomes possible by dint of a strong will to overthrow the entire past of the world, then in a single moment we will join the ranks of independent gods. World history for us will then be nothing but a dreamlike, otherworldly being. The curtain falls and man once more finds himself a child playing with whole worlds. A child awoken by the first glow of morning, who laughingly wipes the frightful dreams from his brow. So, last week we talked about the early and late Nietzsche, but there are still some abiding concerns. There are some abiding intentions and motivations from the early to the late Nietzsche. The version of On the Genealogy of Morals that we've read is in the Walter Kaufmann edition of Nietzsche, and Kaufmann is a particular kind of interpreter and editor of Nietzsche. It's useful because he has nice footnotes to things that are informative, as well as he, in the this modern library collection of Nietzsche, he is including aphorisms that are related to the texts, especially for On the Genealogy of Morals. So he's got, from the middle period of Nietzsche, he's got the relevant aphorisms, as well as we had Beyond Good and Evil, which was the book that On the Genealogy of Morals is a kind of summary essay version of. So Beyond Good and Evil is really the sort of full exposition of the argument, whereas On the Genealogy of Morals is probably the most, besides Thus Spoke Zarathustra, probably the most widely read work by Nietzsche, certainly the most widely taught work by Nietzsche. And Kaufmann, like I said, he has he privileges the late Nietzsche over the early Nietzsche, and there are good reasons for that. One thing I wanted to point out, so genealogy, this term genealogy, maybe it's less current now than it used to be, but this was a favorite word in the era of postmodernist academia. There was always genealogies of this, genealogies of that. Foucault is largely responsible for that. But notice, actually, Nietzsche's not doing a genealogy, right? So Nietzsche was sort of misappropriated by postmodernism to argue for an intellectual method that actually he was not doing. So On the Genealogy of Morals, so that on is important, On the Genealogy of Morals, a polemic, meaning in fact he's making a polemic against a genealogy of morals. So why? What is that about? Well, the 19th century, Nietzsche's time, thought in terms of historical progress and thought of itself as morally progressive as opposed to the past. So there was an idea that moral progress had been made across history, leading to their time in the 19th century. And we still share that idea, this kind of progressivist view of history. that we are more moral today than people in the past were. That we're better morally than people in the past were. Nietzsche is going after that idea because he's interested in more qualitative rather than quantitative change, qualitative transformations. So he's interested in qualitative transformations in the realm of morality, meaning not more moral than people in the past, but moral in a different way than people in the past. Right? So that kind of becomes apples and oranges. And yet there is a development nonetheless. And the development takes the form of reversals. The slave revolt in morality as the most important reversal that he's raising here. We can understand that concept very straightforwardly as modernity, as the bourgeois revolution, as the overthrow of the Anshan regime, the overthrow of feudalism, the overthrow of aristocratic morality. And that has a long history to it. So that didn't happen all at once or just as an event in modern time, but has deep roots going back to the ancient world. It has precedence. And so he's in dialogue with how Western history understands itself as progressing. That's why I sent you guys the Annie Lennox song from The Lord of the Rings, Into the West. Into the West, where we're supposed to sail into the gray havens, into the West. We're supposed to get to socialism? No, we're in capitalism. Because he both agrees and doesn't agree with this idea that there is a West, Western history, and Western civilization, all that stuff, that there's an undeniable reality to that, but he's also attacking some of its assumptions about itself, especially in terms of the history of morality. Right. So before we get into on the genealogy of morals, I wanted to just look at, briefly, another early Nietzsche that, again, superficially can seem postmodernist in certain respects. So there are a few moments in this that I want to call attention to. But let's start with the opening parable that he has. So first of all, on truth and lie in an extra-moral sense. So the reason that I paired this with On the Genealogy of Morals is just to keep in mind where we started the course with Kant, with the true, the good, and the beautiful, meaning aspects of the same thing for the ancients. So the true, the good, and the beautiful are both eternal, unchanging, divine in character. They're the virtues, and they're also aspects of the same thing. The different sides of the same thing. Whereas, in fact, what Kant wanted to do was analytically distinguish them, deal with them as changeable, as changing, and also perhaps the relation between them changes. The relation between the true, the good, and the beautiful. So the way we talked about it in terms of philosophy is the true in terms of use of concepts, epistemology, knowledge. The good as moral, but moral in the sense of practical. How do we attain the good? How do we pursue it? How do we achieve it? And then the beautiful aesthetic judgment generally, just under the heading of the beautiful, even though it includes things like the sublime and the teleological. Okay, so here, the connection between truth and morality. So he's saying, okay, Nietzsche's saying, we're going to separate epistemology from morality. We're going to separate the question of the true from the question of the good. And also introduce not just falsehood, not just true and false, but truth and lying, lie, which is a little bit different from just falsehood. So he writes, in some remote corner of the universe, poured out and glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. That was the haughtiest and most mendacious minute of world history, yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold, and the clever animals had to die. Okay, so first of all, whose perspective is this from? Whose perspective is this from? Like, who could tell this story?
Dinosaurs?
Yeah, God. Yeah, God. The dinosaurs, because maybe this would even be before the dinosaurs. Right? It'd be before humans, but before the dinosaurs. So,
I mean, like dinosaurs were killed, so they died.
sure. So we can tell that story about the dinosaurs, but who could tell that story about us, right? So only God could. It's God's eye view on humanity. And yet, of course, the God's eye view on humanity is our own creation, right? Meaning we have generated this view of ourselves that posits before we existed and after we will no longer exist. So, mentioned in the BBC documentary, Death of God, right? So, it's from The Gay Science, which is a series of aphorisms. It's not just Nietzsche saying it himself, but it's voiced through a character. God is dead and we have killed him. So the full quotation is, God is dead and we have killed him. Meaning the life and death of God has something to do with us. Right? We brought God into life and put him to death. So God was once alive. So God is dead and we have killed him. God was once alive. Meaning this view on ourselves. One might invent such a fable and still not have illustrated sufficiently how wretched, how shadowy and flighty, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect appears in nature. So it appears in nature. So nature and God have this funny shared perspective on humanity. Right, so the fable is told from the standpoint of God, but also that's what human intellect looks from the standpoint of nature. Last week we talked about the dichotomy that Nietzsche drew between art on the one hand and theoretical man on the other hand. So under that heading were science and philosophy. Now we'll see with the later Nietzsche, as I mentioned last week, there's going to be a tripartite division. So there's going to be art and science and philosophy. And philosophy is sort of in the middle between art and science. So art, subjective truth. Science, objective truth. Philosophy, objective truth. But now he's going to sort of trouble this distinction. And I also mentioned, as we had developed this after reading Hegel, that all of these things in some way seem to descend from religion, especially art and philosophy. Science, the descent from religion by science, is less clear. Anthropologically, science has more to do with magic than religion. And in fact, art has something to do with magic as well. But art and philosophy seem to descend from religion, and really philosophy seems to descend most directly from religion. And that's what he's going to be concerned with. So the reason he makes the tripartite distinction is that he actually wants to zero in on the problem of philosophy. And it's embodiment of this division between the subjective and the objective. So, looked at from the standpoint of nature, looked at the standpoint of natural science, perhaps, what is human intellect? Okay. But then he goes back to history. There have been eternities when it did not exist. And when it is done for again, nothing will have happened. For this intellect has no further mission that would lead beyond human life. It is human, rather, and only its owner and producer gives it such importance, as if the world pivoted around it. But if we could communicate with the mosquito, then we would learn that it floats through the air with the same self-importance, feeling within itself the flying center of the world. There is nothing in nature so despicable or insignificant that it cannot immediately be blown up like a bag by a slight breath of this power of knowledge. And just as every porter wants an admirer, the proudest human being, the philosopher, thinks that he sees the eyes of the universe telescopically focused from all sides on his actions and thoughts. Okay, so from the standpoint of nature, what is that standpoint? So, objective perspective on humanity. And again, this is something that we created, so even the standpoint of nature, not only the standpoint of God, but the standpoint of nature wouldn't exist without us. I'm going to jump ahead to closer to the end here. All right. Only through forgetfulness can man ever achieve the illusion of possessing a truth in the sense just designated. If he does not wish to be satisfied with truth in the form of a tautology, that is, with empty shells, then he must forever buy illusions for truths. What is a word? The image of a nerve stimulus in sounds. But to infer from the nerve stimulus a cause outside us, that is already the result of a false and unjustified application of the principle of reason. The different languages set side by side show that what matters with words is never the truth, never an adequate expression. Else there would not be so many languages. The thing in itself, for that is what pure truth without consequences would be. It's quite incomprehensible to the creators of language and not at all worth aiming for. One designates only the relations of things to man, and to express them one calls on the boldest metaphors. A nerve stimulus first transposed into an image, first metaphor. The image in turn imitated by a sound, second metaphor. Let us still give special consideration to the formation of concepts. So not just words, but concepts. Every word immediately becomes a concept, inasmuch as it is not intended to serve as a reminder of the unique and wholly individualized original experience to which it owes its birth, but must at the same time fit innumerable more or less similar cases, which means, strictly speaking, never equal. In other words, a lot of unequal cases. Every concept originates through our equating what is unequal. No leaf ever wholly equals another, and the concept leaf is formed through an arbitrary abstraction from these individual differences, through forgetting the distinctions. And now it gives rise to the idea that in nature there might be something besides the leaves, which would be leaf, some kind of original form after which all leaves have been woven, marked, copied, colored, curled, and painted, but by unskilled hands, so that no copy turned out to be the correct, reliable, and faithful image of the original form. We call a person honest. Why did he act so honestly today, we ask. Our answer usually sounds like this, because of his honesty. Honesty, that is to say again, the leaf is the cause of the leaves. After all, we know nothing of an essence-like quality named honesty. We know only numerous individualized and thus unequal actions, which we equate by omitting the unequal and by then calling them honest actions. In the end, we distill from them a qualitas occulta, a occult quality with the name of honesty. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are: metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors. In moral terms, the obligation to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie herd-like in a style obligatory for all.
That was crazy.
Well, it's also kind of true.
What?
It's also kind of true.
No, I mean, like, crazy true.
Yeah, crazy true, exactly. All right, so what he's introducing here are questions of metaphysics, meaning, and we know this from postmodernism, again, I'm not sure that rhetorically this is still current, but pluralizing things. Pluralizing things, right? There's no feminism, there are only feminisms. There's no Marxism, there are only Marxisms, or what have you, right? So there's no leaf, there are only leaves, right? As if that gets at the problem. It doesn't really. But anyway, what is he saying? He's saying that the concept of leaf refers to a metaphysical object that the empirical object is never equivalent to. Then he switches from that kind of physical object or empirical experiential phenomenon to a moral category, honesty. So anything that ends with a Y is a metaphysical concept. Right, so if it ends with a Y, it's a metaphysical object, not a physical or empirical object. And he's saying there's no such thing as honesty. There are only honest actions. And, of course, there's what we might call honestism, the obligation to be honest. Right, so there's a kind of hypothesization of the metaphysical object in moral terms to turn honest actions into a general value that everyone ought to abide by. Right, so we see with this early Nietzsche, actually, he's already laying out a program that he's going to fulfill, at least he's going to try, on the genealogy of morals. Right, so truth and lie in an extra-moral sense. How can lying be an extra-moral phenomenon? How could it not have to do with morality? But we'll see. Again, the epistemological versus the moral philosophical or the ethical. And what is the relationship between these things? And what does it mean to even know this? To know that morality is just a societally imposed obligation. That it has no inherent truth to it. What's the value of such knowledge? Okay. Let's see how he starts out. We are unknown to ourselves, we men of knowledge, and with good reason. We have never sought ourselves. How could it happen that we should ever find ourselves? It has rightly been said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Our treasure is where the beehives of our knowledge are. We are constantly making for them, being by nature winged creatures and honey gatherers of the spirit. There is one thing alone we really care about from the heart, bringing something home. Whatever else there is in life, so-called experiences, which of us has sufficient earnestness for them or sufficient time? Present experience has, I'm afraid, always found us absent-minded. We cannot give our hearts to it, not even our ears. Rather, as one divinely preoccupied and immersed in himself, into whose ear the bell has just boomed with all its strength, the 12 beats of noon, suddenly starts up and asks himself, what really was that which just struck? So we sometimes rub our ears afterward and ask, utterly surprised and disconcerted, what really was that which we have just experienced? And moreover, who are we really? And afterward, as aforesaid, count the 12 trembling bell strokes of our experience, our life, our being, and alas, miscount them. So we are necessarily strangers to ourselves. We do not comprehend ourselves. We have to misunderstand ourselves. For us, the law, each is furthest from himself, applies to all eternity. We are not men of knowledge with respect to ourselves. Okay, so what does men of knowledge mean? So, first of all, the philosopher. Right, so he's going to own being a philosopher. He's going to own that in a self-critical way. But he's also referring to the fact that in the 19th century, and for a long time before, again, what we read last week, with Socrates, the birth of theoretical man, that we value knowledge above all else. Right, so as a culture, we could say, as a society, the 19th century especially values scientific progress above all else. Still the case? Still the case. But that knowledge, like he discussed last week in The Birth of Tragedy, that knowledge is always outside of ourselves. Right, so the world has become a depth that can't be plumbed fully. Right, so kind of world becomes an infinite depth of the pursuit of knowledge, and we never actually attain full knowledge of anything. It's a kind of infinite task that we've given ourselves. And he thought that that's what comes from placing knowledge and the truth objectively outside of us and divorcing the subjective from the objective. And so we value science as a society, as a culture. We have a much more difficult time valuing art or philosophy. And science has become our religion in a funny kind of way, which is peculiar. But for Nietzsche, the separation of these things and their apparent antagonism we'll see as a symptom. There's a symptom here. And it's not just a bad thing. It's not a dead end. It's not like a cul-de-sac that we've mistakenly let ourselves into. It's a symptom of an illness, but the way pregnancy is an illness, meaning it's something to be undergone to bring forth new life. And that's his whole point. So, infamously, Nietzsche is the overman, Superman advocate. Right? He's advocating the coming of the overman or the Superman. The Übermensch. The alternative being the last man. Right? So he thinks that Western society, Western culture, Western civilization has taken this path and has arrived at this crisis. The choice, apparently, between the last man and the overman. So, nihilism, the nihilism of that, is not a dead end, but it's a symptom. It threatens to be a dead end, but it's really just a symptom. It demands a self-overcoming. So I think we've talked about this being and becoming, transformation, freedom. The BBC documentary said that this is a radical philosophy of freedom. It is. So what would what would overcoming modern nihilism amount to? What would it mean? I'll just mention that when he's writing in the late 1800s, in other domains, so not just Nietzsche is observing this, but also nascent sociology is observing this. It seems like there's a crisis of meaning, a crisis of moral values, a crisis of social values, a crisis of the meaning of life that has emerged in the 19th century. So Emile Durkheim, writing a little bit later than Nietzsche, his first book is on suicide. He's a French sociologist. His first book is on suicide. It's on the peculiarity of modern society being the first society in which common people commit suicide. Because for ancient people, suicide was like a virtue. Only priests and aristocrats committed suicide. Peasants didn't. There's death before dishonor, that kind of idea. Whereas in modernity, we have deaths of despair, we have suicide due to meaninglessness. So suicide in the past represented the preservation of meaning, whereas in the present it represents the loss of meaning. So that kind of nihilism afflicting the civilization, broadly, deeply, thoroughly. Nihilism. Jumping ahead here to the end of the preface. So I mentioned last week that he thinks that Zarathustra's his essential work, which is a kind of mixed work of literature and philosophy, because he wrote it to present his philosophy in an accessible form. Whether it works or not is another question, because then he had to explain it in many other works. He had to continually explain Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Says, if this book is incomprehensible to anyone and jars on his ears, the fault, it seems to me, is not necessarily mine. It is clear enough, assuming, as I do assume, that one has first read my earlier writings, and has not spared some trouble in doing so, for they are indeed not easy to penetrate. Regarding my Zarathustra, for example, I do not allow that anyone knows that book who has not at some time been profoundly wounded, and at some time profoundly delighted by every word in it. For only then may he enjoy the privilege of reverentially sharing in the halcyon element out of which that book was born, and in its sunlight clarity, remoteness, breadth, and certainty. In other cases, people find difficulty with the aphoristic form. This arises from the fact that today this form is not taken seriously enough. An aphorism properly stamped and molded has not been deciphered when it has been simply read. Rather, one has then to begin its exegesis, for which is required an art of exegesis. He says, I have offered in the third essay of the present book an example of what I regard as exegesis in such a case. An aphorism is prefixed to this essay. The essay itself is a commentary on it. To be sure, one thing is necessary above all if one is to practice reading as an art in this way, something that has been unlearned most thoroughly nowadays, and therefore it will be some time before my writings are readable. Something for which one has almost to be a cow, and in any case not a modern man, rumination. And so exegesis is a process of rumination, chewing on it. It's offering something to chew on. All right. So the first thing I want to do with this piece is say there are three essays, and the most important essay is the one that comes last, of course, because it's his conclusion, and it's the one that people either don't get to or remains obscure to them. So usually people are impressed by the fireworks of the first two essays and neglect the point, which is the third essay. Right, so they think that the whole argument is in the first two essays. Now, the first two essays are just setting up the argument. The third essay is really delivering the argument. Right, so it's all preliminary. We don't really get to the modern situation until the third essay. What we get instead in the first two essays are the lead up to the modern situation, meaning how did we get here, and also how does the past look from the standpoint of the present. So in the Truth and Lie in an Extra Moral Sense, he mentioned anthropomorphisms. I want to introduce another idea, which is what Nietzsche does, the zoomorphism. So if anthropomorphism is attributing human qualities to animals, then zoomorphism is attributing animal-like qualities to humans. All right, so you'll notice that in the first two essays, he really animalizes the human in a very profound way, and he uses a lot of striking phrases and images that have stuck with the interpretation of Nietzsche in an abiding way, like the blonde beast. The blonde beast. What is the blonde beast? A lion, right? A lion. And the blonde races that are blonde beasts, including the Japanese and the Arabs, like the warrior races. Okay. So this is not some kind of Nordic, not Hulk Hogan. That's not the point. And it is a zoomorphism. In other words, it refers to when humans were still animals and not yet human. All right, we'll see that the noble morality is actually not yet a human morality. It's important. Birds of prey. Birds of prey. Birds of prey. Not human. Birds of prey. Now, we haven't really talked about anthropological history, but I want to make some mention of this in terms of longue durée history. So, history of civilization. I mentioned Western civilization, but not just Western civilization. History of all civilization. Since the Neolithic Revolution, since the agricultural revolution, 12,000 years ago, all civilizations, all classical civilizations throughout the world, everywhere, in Europe, Asia, Africa, in the Western Hemisphere as well, all classical civilizations everywhere have had the same structure. They've had two ruling castes, and then they had the commoners beneath them. The two ruling castes, the priestly caste and the warrior caste. The priestly caste and the warrior caste. Marxism calls this class society, the birth of class society. This is what the agricultural revolution brings about, the birth of class society. Before that is primitive communism. It's the classless society that humans lived in for 100,000 years before the agricultural revolution, at least 100,000 years before the agricultural revolution, and still continue to live in that condition. The Eskimos, the Pacific Islanders, the Austronesian peoples, and a lot of people in the Western Hemisphere, and also in parts of Asia and Africa. Parts of Europe too, but marginally. Hunter-gatherers as opposed to settled farmers, agricultural civilization. So, priestly caste, warrior caste. Priestly caste, warrior caste. Good and evil, good and bad.
Are the three classes like the three estates pre-revolution, French Revolution?
Yeah, the three estates, that's right. So the Estates General in France, it's a medieval institution, but it's reinterpreted under absolutism, starting with Louis XIV, and then famously during the French Revolution, the calling of the Estates General due to the financial crisis of the state. So Louis XVI called the Estates General the three estates. The first estate, the church; the second estate, the aristocracy; the third estate, the commoners. And the French Revolution took place because of the revolt of the third estate. So the third estate walked out of the Estates General and went to the tennis court at Versailles and took the tennis court oath and said, we are the National Assembly, fuck the two estates, and the king can go with us or he can go with them. Right, and that was the French Revolution. And the pamphlet of the French Revolution that was most widely read was written by a priest, the Abbé Sieyès. What is the Third Estate? And he famously said, up till now the Third Estate has been nothing. The Third Estate wants to be something. The Third Estate shall be everything. And of course, that's the world that we live in now. In case you guys didn't know. The commoners revolted, the Third Estate revolted, the slaves revolted, and overthrew slavery. That's what happened. For the first time in history. That's Nietzsche's world, right? Nietzsche is living in the aftermath of that, and still dealing with the repercussions of that. Actually, 2025, we're still dealing with the repercussions of that. That wasn't that long ago. In comparison to the thousands of years of the caste system, the present system is pretty recent. Okay. Priestly caste, warrior caste, the church. You could also say, because Nietzsche's going to address it all, between this week and next week, he's going to address it all. The church was overthrown not just in 1789, the church was overthrown in the Protestant Reformation. Meaning, Christianity was taken out of the hands of the priesthood and put in the hands of the commoners. They translated the Bible. Anyone could be a pastor of a church. You didn't have to go through the system of the church. The church was overthrown. It's part of the emergence of bourgeois society. Over hundreds of years this took place, but the Protestant Reformation in particular. So there are a few different moments in this long slave revolt of morality that he's going to be tracing. And that's where he's starting us. So good and bad is an aristocratic distinction. Good and evil is a priestly distinction. Right, so good and bad means good and not so good. Right, it's a hierarchy of value. Meaning the strong versus the weak. The beautiful versus the ugly. The intelligent versus the stupid. Good and bad. Good and evil, though, that's a different distinction. It's a very different distinction. And the transvaluation of values, this is his phrase, transvaluation of values. The first transvaluation of values was the overthrow of the good and bad distinction by the good and evil distinction. So how is that the case? Because what was good in the good and bad distinction becomes evil in the good and evil distinction. And what was bad in the good and bad distinction becomes good in the good and evil distinction. So the good becomes evil and the bad becomes good. Christianity, the last shall be first. What? Blessed are the sick. Blessed are the sick. What? How is it blessed to be sick? It sucks to be sick. It's not good at all. But it might be morally better than health. What? Right. So a lot that we take for granted is really a profoundly deep question. How did that happen? So that's the first transvaluation of values. And he thinks that modern European man, Western civilization, is on the brink of another transvaluation of values on this order of magnitude. Right, that's why the book that This essay, or 3 essays, seeks to summarize Beyond Good and Evil, a philosophy for the future. That's the subtitle of Beyond Good and Evil, a philosophy for the future. Meaning the future will be beyond good and evil. In fact, we're already beyond good and evil. We're already beyond good and evil. Capitalism is beyond good and evil. In any traditional sense. Certainly in any religious sense. We've gone way beyond good and evil already. So that's what raises these questions. How does a transvaluation of values occur? What was the first instance of this that one can posit? And what's the significance of it? What does it mean? Now, he starts off with a kind of peculiar opening gambit, and that's to bring in what he calls psychology, and specifically the English psychologists. So what does that mean? So Germany, here's another little point. Germany in the 19th century is relatively backward in comparison to France and England and the United States. Germany is a backwater. It's kind of provincial. It's less developed. It's also politically backward. It's even culturally backward. So this gave rise to a distinction that would be made in German intellectual life between civilization and culture. Civilization and culture. So the idea is that the Germans have culture, and the French, the British, and the Americans have civilization. The distinction is between the Greek and the Roman. Basically, Greece is where we get philosophy, art, and Rome is where we get politics and the state, law. And then there's a third city, and that's Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the city of divine revelation and faith. Germany sees itself as the inheritor of Athens and Jerusalem, whereas it sees the French and the British and the Americans as the inheritors of Rome. Civilization versus culture. Nietzsche is hostile to this idea, but it's a very entrenched idea. Okay, so English psychologists. So England as the hegemonic power of the 19th century. Pax Britannica. He's writing in the middle of Pax Britannica. So what's Pax Britannica? That's the period from the defeat of Napoleon to World War I. So it's 100 years in which Britain is the top power in the world. British Empire is at its greatest extent, and it is the most advanced politically, economically, culturally, scientifically, including social science. So for Nietzsche, in Nietzsche's time, and again in our own time, actually psychology, as distinct from psychiatry, psychology is considered a social science. So what does it mean to treat psychology as a social science? So he has in mind British social science, liberal social science, liberal psychology, also liberal political economy, so utilitarianism. If you guys know anything about utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham from the turn of the 19th century, the happiness principle, the greatest good for the greatest number. Right, so society should be organized according to the principle, the greatest good for the greatest number. A lot of this, again, he's turning into a matter of psychology, and then he himself will identify more as a psychologist than as a philosopher. So that tension between the role of the philosopher and the role of the psychologist. So a philosopher might announce themselves to be discovering truth. A psychologist, on the other hand, is diagnosing a condition. Right, so that's an important distinction. And also in terms of self-knowledge gives you access to the truth not necessarily of metaphysics in the sense of philosophy, but the truth that one discovers in oneself might be a psychological truth. So that tension is very deliberate between philosophy and psychology, and what it means to interpret philosophy as psychology. I don't know if we talked about this last time with Aristotle. Aristotle's theory of drama, theory of tragedy, is actually a psychological theory of tragedy, catharsis. I don't know if we touched on that point last time, that again, in the early Nietzsche, we already have some inklings of this. Like, is Aristotle really doing philosophy, or is he doing psychology, especially as regard art? Right, so how art functions. Is Aristotle reducing aesthetic experience to psychology? It's one of the marks against it, we might say. Now, I mentioned the 19th century notion of progress, especially progress in morality. So the English, as the dominant country, of course, think of themselves as the most progressive and advanced morally. Morally. To have made the greatest moral advance. So it says, these English psychologists, whom one also has to thank for the only attempts hitherto to arrive at a history of the origin of morality, they themselves are no easy riddle. I confess that, as living riddles, they even possess one essential advantage over their books. They are interesting. These English psychologists, what do they really want? One always discovers them voluntarily or involuntarily at the same task, namely at dragging the partie honteuse of our inner world into the foreground and seeking the truly effective and directing agent, that which has been decisive in its evolution, in just that place where the intellectual pride of man would least desire to find it. In the inertia of habit, for example, or in forgetfulness, or in a blind and chance mechanistic hooking together of ideas, or in something purely passive, automatic, reflexive, molecular, and thoroughly stupid. What is it really that always drives these psychologists in just this direction? Is it a secret, malicious, vulgar, perhaps self-deceiving instinct for belittling man? Or possibly a pessimistic suspicion, the mistrustfulness of disappointed idealists grown spiteful and gloomy? Or a petty subterranean hostility and rancor towards Christianity and Plato that has perhaps not even crossed the threshold of consciousness? Or even a lascivious taste for the grotesque, the painfully paradoxical, the questionable, and absurd in existence? Or finally, something of each of them, a little vulgarity, a little gloominess, a little anti-Christianity, a little itching and need for spice. But I am told that they are simply old, cold, and tedious frogs, creeping around men and into men as if in their own proper element, that is, in a swamp. I rebel at this idea. More, I do not believe it. And if one may be allowed to hope where one does not know, then I hope from my heart that they may be the reverse of this, that these investigators and microscopists of the soul may be fundamentally brave, proud, and magnanimous animals, who know how to keep their hearts as well as their suffering in bounds, and have trained themselves to sacrifice all desirability to truth, every truth, even plain, harsh, ugly, repellent, unchristian, immoral truth. For such truths do exist. Okay. Jump ahead here. Notice he makes an exception of Herbert Spencer. So Herbert Spencer is someone who's a contemporary of his, and I will also point out that Herbert Spencer was the most famous and popular philosopher of the time. So he's a kind of liberal philosopher, and very critical of the state and of the political sphere of his time. And also his philosophy, especially his social philosophy, tended to understand the development of society out of religion. So he saw a sort of long history of society in terms of the history of religion, and he criticized his current society as having put the state in the place of God, having put politics in the place of God. So as a liberal, he criticized that, what he called the modern political superstition. Herbert Spencer is someone that Nietzsche's making a little bit of an exception for. Okay. The signpost to the right road was for me the question, what was the real etymological significance of the designations for good coined in the various languages? I found they all led back to the same conceptual transformation. But everywhere noble, aristocratic in the social sense is the basic concept from which good in the sense of with aristocratic soul, noble, with the soul of a high order, with a privileged soul necessarily developed. A development which always runs parallel with that other in which common, plebeian, low are finally transformed into the concept bad. Now, I'll just say another weird postmodernist tick that is taken from Nietzsche is etymology, meaning that if you know the history of a word, that somehow that explains the concept, which is a strange kind of Bowdlerization of Nietzsche. So where's Nietzsche coming from? Nietzsche was trained, he wasn't really trained in philosophy, he was trained in classical philology. We talked about this last time. So he was trained as a, we could say, historian of language, and he and his closest colleagues, his kind of intellectual collaborators, were philologists in this sense. So he knew people well who studied classical languages, non-Western classical languages, like Sanskrit, Arabic, Hebrew. He's Greek and Latin. Chinese, they also studied. So classical philology, and that's where he's bringing in this etymological approach. So the history of language, the history of words, changes in meaning in language, changes in meaning in words subtly across history that seems to index changes in concepts. Excuse me. So they get at the history of a concept through the history of language. That's the idea. And again, this is something that the postmodernists have keyed into and tried to imitate to a certain extent. Whether it's a good or bad effect, who knows? It says the most convincing example of the latter is the German word schlecht, bad, itself, which is identical with schlicht, plain and simple. Compare schlechtweg, plainly, schlechterding, simply, and originally designated the plain, the common man, as yet with no inculpatory implication, and simply in contradistinction to the nobility. About the time of the 30 Years' War, late enough therefore, this meaning changed into the one now customary. Okay, so what's the significance of the 30 Years' War? That's the war of the Protestant Reformation. Right, so he's associating a change with that bourgeois revolutionary war of the Protestant Reformation. With regard to a moral genealogy, this seems to me a fundamental insight. That it has been arrived at so late is the fault of the retarding influence exercised by the democratic prejudice in the modern world toward all questions of origin. And this is so even in the apparently quite objective domain of natural science and physiology, as I shall merely hint here. But what mischief this prejudice is capable of doing, especially to morality and history, once it has been unbridled to the point of hatred, is shown by the notorious case of Buckle. Here the plebeianism of the modern spirit, which is of English origin, erupted once again on its native soil as violently as a mud volcano, and with that salty, noisy, vulgar eloquence with which all volcanoes have spoken hitherto. With regard to our problem, which may have good ground to be called a quiet problem, and one which fastidiously directs itself to few ears, it is of no small interest to ascertain that through these words and roots which designate good, there frequently still shines the most important nuance by virtue of which the noble felt themselves to be men of a higher rank. Granted that, in the majority of cases, they designate themselves simply by their superiority in power, as the powerful, the masters, the commanders, or by the most clearly visible signs of this superiority, for example, as the rich, the possessors. This is the meaning of Arya and of corresponding words in Iranian and Slavic. But they also do it by a typical character trait, and this is the case that concerns us here. They call themselves, for instance, the truthful, and this is so above all of the Greek nobility, whose mouthpiece is the Megarian poet Theognis. The root of the word coined for this, eslos, signifies one who is, who possesses reality, who is actual, who is true. Then, with the subjective turn, the true as the truthful, in this phase of conceptual transformation, it becomes a slogan and catchword of the nobility and passes over entirely into the sense of noble as distinct from the lying common man, which is what Theognis takes him to be and how he describes him, until finally, after the decline of the nobility, the word is left to designate nobility of soul and becomes, as it were, ripe and sweet. Okay, so one of the main points here is that the good-bad distinction is one in which the good define themselves as the good. So it's self-defining. So the good in the good-bad distinction, the good is self-defining. So it's I am good as opposed to the other who is bad. The good and evil distinction, by contrast, is not self-defined but other-defined, meaning I'm good in comparison to the other who is evil. So it's defined in contradistinction to the other. It's not self-defined. It's other-defined. Right? So the powerful are evil. Say the powerless. And we're good. Right? So it's not self-defined, it's other-defined. That's important. It's again, the first instance of a transvaluation of values. It's also one in which a step towards the human is made out of the animal world. So the self-defining good is, again, not quite really a moral distinction, other than, as he puts it, in terms of the morality of mores, meaning the morality of practices, meaning the practices that serve to maintain the good. And he makes an indication of it here in terms of why noble would be truthful and why common would be lying. The idea would be that the bad are incapable of being truthful. So not everyone is capable of being truthful. Not everyone is being capable of being honest. Not everyone is capable of the honor code. Not everyone has honor. So the common person, as opposed to the aristocratic has honor. The common person does not have honor. And that's connected to this idea of honesty, truthfulness, right? You can trust someone who's capable of honoring their word. You can't trust people who are incapable of honoring their word.
Is it connected to the idea of honor?
Maybe. What were you thinking about that?
But, I mean, I was kind of relating it to that, those who can afford humanity are those who are free.
Sure, absolutely. And certainly in terms of ancient philosophy. So in terms of ancient philosophy, the good are free because they're capable of being free, and the bad are slaves because they're incapable of freedom.
Yeah, so it's not like a trade or like a assigned at will situation.
But he also talks about like the pure man as like this naive notion to the extent that it can be read as like a ruse. It's like taking all literal and all literality. Like the aristocratic purity wasn't just like we're washing
Mm-hmm.
it was like in a naive way try to themselves as pure in a way that's not just related to station and sort of the mundane things.
That they embodied some kind of virtue.
A divine purity.
Yeah, that it
Described purity.
that's right. So, right, so what he's setting up here is something which is perhaps anthropologically or archaeologically, historically questionable, which is the idea that the aristocrats were on top to begin with, and then they were overthrown by the priests. Right, so in other words, the sense of divinity that you were just mentioning changes. Right, so that because he also thought that in the community, the noble or aristocratic were self-evidently so. So they were seen as good by everyone. Right, so they defined themselves what was good, but also everyone also regarded them as good, and therefore as embodying kind of a divine virtue or blessing, that they were ennobled in a divine way. The priestly caste, on the other hand, has a different connection to divinity and divine truth, and therefore is in conflict with the warrior caste. And that's how he sets up, the distinction.
I got a little confused when he was talking about the Counter-Reformation, and he was talking about the Catholic Church as like the noble side of the
Uh-huh.
equation. Like, he's talking
Sure.
about Protestantism as this sort of like white boy.
Yeah, plebeian.
Right. So, but then like that kind of seems to contradict the way he talks about priests in a more trans-historical sense or in a broader sense. So how is the priestly class, in the specific case of Reformation, nobility is more esteemed? But
All right,
they're also
so-
they're also like the being towards death sort of, or like the weary of life sort of class. How can they be both?
All right, so let's think about this historically. So historically, what you mentioned was by birth, right?
Yeah.
So noble by birth. Priests are not priests by birth, really. I mean, in some ways, there were like tribes that served as providing the personnel for the priestly caste. Like there is some complicated history here. But let's just look at medieval Christendom before the Protestant Reformation, traditional Christianity, the Catholic Church. So how did it go in terms of the priestly caste? Where did they come from? So the firstborn son would inherit the title, would carry on the dynasty. The secondborn son, however, would become a priest. That's how that worked, right? So there was a constant mixing of the aristocracy and the priesthood. And that was a way that the church kept control of the nobility. It's also a way that the nobility was invested in the church. But the church was the dominant institution. There's no doubt that the church was the dominant institution. However, in this interesting way, meaning other people could also be recruited into the priesthood, like commoners could become priests as well, but on the church's own terms. And so, generally speaking, the church governed itself, and it governed the nobility. In traditional Christianity, in the Catholic era, like the peasants, do you know what the term pagan means? Pagan means peasant. Meaning the peasants weren't really Christian. They were doing the folk religion from pre-Christianity. So the common people become Christian only with the Protestant Reformation. That's when Christianity becomes like thorough. Otherwise, the only people for whom Christianity is a decisive thing are the clergy itself, the priesthood, and the aristocracy. Those are the ones who have to be Christian. Mm-hmm.
What role did women play in the concept of mobility in the context of like Catholicism and things like that?
Well, okay, so that's a complicated one. On the one hand, aristocratic women were aristocrats, meaning they're part of the warrior caste. So everything that the warrior caste does is about war, right? Including sex, marriage, like it's all war. Everything is war.
Are you using warrior and aristocrat interchangeably?
Yes, absolutely. They are. Right? They are. So the other thing is, in terms of women, like we have our own modern prejudices about this, and also Christianity has been bourgeoisified, and so we read scripture a certain way. A peasant woman and an aristocratic woman, apples and oranges. Apples and oranges. So what Nietzsche is concerned with, I'll point out another issue. Classical antiquity. So the Greeks went through their period, and then the Romans come along and appropriate Greek culture and give it their own spin. And then the fall of the Roman Empire happens through its Christianization, as well as through its overthrow by the Germans. But it remains, Germanic civilization, European civilization remains Roman. It's a post-Roman civilization. So there's an admixture of things that occurs. So, Christianity comes out of Judaism, but then it takes on a Roman flavor, and then it's Germanized. And of course, the Germans who conquer the Roman Empire themselves have a caste system. And they install themselves as the warrior caste throughout Europe. So they are the nobility. So a very simple way of illustrating this is in the Roman era, Britain was Britain. France was Gaul. So why did it become France? Because it was conquered by the Franks. So the German tribe, the Franks, installed themselves as the aristocracy in France. The indigenous population were Celtic people, they were Gauls. In the same way that the Anglo-Saxons conquered Britain, and the British people were Celtic peoples, also subjugated by the Germanic invaders. So they installed themselves as the aristocracy. So there was, a difference right there. So again, the modern sort of national identity is a very kind of bourgeois late development. That wasn't there in the medieval era. And it's not there, again, coming out of classical antiquity. And he's interested in those transitions. He's interested in how and why Rome became Christianized. And also how the Germans were Romanized and Christianized in their conquering the Roman Empire and in succeeding the Roman Empire. Right, so that is really, again, built into the caste system are all sorts of things.
Just trying to
Yeah.
contextualize, what century is Clovis and the Ride of the Franks and all this you're talking about? This is like
Medieval. This is like,
8th and 9th century?
yeah, it's the Frankish kingdoms. There's the Holy Roman Empire, which is again, I don't know if we talked about this, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Right, that's the joke. But it's basically the Germans. It's the and it's Charlemagne, right, Charles the Great. Now the Frankish kingdoms are later, so I'm trying to, I don't remember what century it is, but it's sort of right there in the Middle Ages.
Frankish as in what France is today? Frankish as in what France is today?
Well, there's some overlap, but they're not identical. No, geographically it's a little bit different. I mean, they're generally the same, but...
I would like what France is belonged to.
Oh, yes.
Was that
Normandy.
Was that 1066?
That's later, yeah.
Norman invasion.
The Norman invasions, yeah. So Normandy, the Normans, yeah.
So are the French the Normans, or is the Normans part of the Frankish?
I think the Normans are...
The Normans are French.
There's a region in France that is still called
Brittany, right.
Well, there's Normandy as well.
And there's Normandy, right.
But I think the French came to Britain.
With the 100 Years' War, they went back and forth. 100 Years' War, they went back and forth across the channel.
Clovis is much earlier, though.
Right.
Yeah, much earlier.
The Franks conquered Gaul in the late 5th, early 6th centuries.
Right, so I was getting to the point about women, gender, right? Yeah, like that. So I think that that's the other point to make, is that aristocratic women are still aristocratic women. Meaning we're not talking about like women in general, we're talking about the status of aristocratic women. And you know, they participate in the dynasties, of course, they participate in the political realm, they participate in the cultural realm, they participate also in the religious realm. So again, what a noble in crisis goes to the monastery or the nunnery. Right, so they go into religious retreat, basically, and they go through a kind of spiritual, existential, awakening. Right, so, but again, the women who did that were the aristocratic women. Peasant women weren't doing that. Right, so, it's complicated because a lot of the sexism that we associate kind of naturalize with modernity, it's not quite the same thing. There are roots for it in the ancient world and in the medieval world, but it's a little bit different. And the medieval world is different from the Roman world and the Greek world. There are some important differences there between the ancient Mediterranean civilizations and European civilization, and especially in Christendom. And then,
Are you saying that like sexism and patriarchy is very much associated, if not accelerated by modernity?
yeah, I think it's reified. I think that it's sort of, it's like biologized. There are all sorts of things that happen in the modern era that are very, again, to us seem like, oh, sexism has been there since Adam and Eve. It's not as straightforward as that. And especially Nietzsche would be interested in those kinds of changes, those kind of subtle changes that, in fact, underneath are more reversals of values. But he's projecting back from the 19th century. And I think that I already mentioned to you that Nietzsche's going to be our one kind of misogynist thinker, we might say. Yeah, sort of frankly so. But so much so that it sort of almost suggests its opposite. It's kind of like there's a pathos there, for what it's worth. Okay. Let me turn to...
Chris, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of bugging me.
Yeah, go ahead.
So like earlier today, I understand the sense in which like the title on Genealogy of Morals of Polemic it's a polemic against the sort of like established body of discourse, the psychologists.
Positing moral progress.
Right, but like when you say that he's not closing, I have a hard time with this idea that you said that he's actually not doing a genealogy himself. It very much feels like a genealogy. You're like tracing back these terms, we're finding their inflections and reversals across discursive periodizations. So like in what sense do you mean that he's not doing a genealogy?
Well, genealogy just means like a family tree, like a descent.
Sure.
You know, like a transmission of values across generations, right? So literally genealogy, you know, what's the origin of something?
Right, but the way the term is used in a sort of like scholarly analytical way, it's kind of what he's doing. Like you mentioned Foucault, like what is Foucault doing differently that makes his genealogical, and what Nietzsche doing here is not genealogical?
Well, I mean, Foucault is a Nietzschean. He is, I'll grant him that. However, I think that there are some important alterations made to Nietzsche by Foucault, but we'll leave that to one side. So what Foucault and Nietzsche have in common is to question this idea of progress and put in place a notion of qualitative transformation, so not quantitative progress. So here would be an example. So Christianity. Christianity is really central to what Nietzsche is discussing. So the 19th century is scientific, it's progressive, it's capitalistic, it's all sorts of things. It's also still Christian in a certain way. And from the standpoint of Christianity, in the 19th century, let's say among the English, and the kind of harmony of science and Christianity that one observes at that time, in the Victorian era, that's when Nietzsche's writing. Then the idea would be, Jesus gave us his gospel, and so Christianity was established like 2,000 years or earlier, nearly. However, people weren't really quite Christian back then, right? And so people have become more Christian over time. So that the idea would be that in the 19th century, Christians are more fulfilling Christianity than they had been in the Middle Ages. Like just that assumption. So you could say, okay, well, there's this kind of genealogy, a descent from the apostolic Christians, the first disciples, the apostles of Jesus himself, all the way up to the present. And Nietzsche's challenging that idea, that you can trace it back directly in that way. Instead, Christianity has meant all sorts of things at different moments in history, and reversals in meaning have occurred.
Okay, no, gotcha. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, isn't something that goes through this kind of like nonlinear process of reversals, changes, left turns, right turns, circuitous routes, like
still a genealogy.
That's still a genealogy. Like I guess that's what I take the word genealogy to mean, is precisely tracing those nonlinear, because without those it's just the thing just remains the same, right? Like there's nothing to really analyze.
Mm-hmm.
There's only the capacity for a genealogy, I suppose, if you have ruptures, breaks, starts and stops. I guess that's how I always thought of the term genealogy and like the way it's used in the scholarly fashion, as opposed to the way I understand what you said just now. It's not genealogical in the sense of linear programmatic.
Yeah, what genealogy would have meant in Nietzsche's own time is different from.
It would be more programmatic. Linear.
Yeah, because now we have a Nietzschean definition of genealogy now,
okay.
Right? And so I think that the confusion comes in when the philosophy of history and the question of development and progress, because he's not going to entirely throw out the notion of progress. He's going to throw out the assumptions of progress. So there is, something does progress through these transvaluation of values, through these reversals. Something does develop, something does progress. And, in that sense, he's not completely trashing the 19th century conception of itself, but he is complicating it or problematizing it. And again, it's not like he's arguing against something. He's facing what is obscure and confused about the self-conception that people of the 19th century had. Right, so that's why it's polemical. Right, so a history of morality, any other history of morality would be quite different from Nietzsche's in his own time. Like, that's kind of clear. You know, he thinks he's telling a story that is not otherwise being told. So he's highlighting that kind of really contradiction. Andrew.
Yeah, pure refresh the page.
Yes, okay. So you've edited it? Okay, because I noticed that you did not include it. All right, great. Excellent. Cool. All right, so you've got 2 sets of notes. All right. So maybe we'll start with other notes.
Yeah, so talk mostly about the mass morality, state morality, and like he mentions that we're living, I guess, in this kind of like a kind of resentful world, and that like we're just kind of we don't act on anything or in revenge anyway. We just kind of wait for God to judge, and like it's like we just think that we'll get their comeuppance in the afterlife. And like, there's a quote of kind of when the oppressed, downtrodden, outraged, exhort one another with the eventual coming of impotence. Let us be different from evil, name of good, and he is good, he does not outrage. He harms nobody, he does not attack, he does not inflict, he leaves revenge to God. And like goes on. But like I guess we're beyond that now. But there's still like a definite like they'll get their comeuppance eventually, type of thing. But I think
Vengeance is mine, says God.
right. But I think it's like separate from God now to some degree. That feeling.
Karma?
Yeah. I guess. But like, yeah, it's not. It doesn't work.
I think there are people who still believe.
Yeah, there's a different
Like, I mean, it depends
Yeah.
on who you ask. I don't think it's the dominant. Yeah.
No, but people, yeah, still think. Yeah.
But,
So let me say something about resentment.
yeah.
Okay, so resentment is not the same thing as resentment.
Okay. That's different.
Yeah, that's why he uses the crazy French word. And so resentment is pretty straightforward. Right, so resentment, I think the way you put it is the state of being resentful.
Okay.
Right, but
Yeah.
so that's a good sort of first determination. Resentment is really about, like resentment, you resent the other. Resentment, you resent your own condition. And then the question is, what do you do with that?
You can, but I've heard this talk about like it's different from resentment. You resent your own condition, but only vis-a-vis the other. Like if the other wasn't there as a superior, like above you or whatever, then you couldn't resent your own position. Like it's only vis-a-vis the other.
It's projected onto the other. So the other is blamed for one's condition, but the feeling, he thinks, comes from one's own condition. Right? So it's not really a competition. You know, it's not like, oh, I hate those who are above me or who have it better than me. It's rather, I hate that I have it so bad, and I hate the others for seemingly not sharing my condition, and I kind of blame them. Yeah, so it's other, to use psychological terms, it's other directed. And yet, It comes from within. Now the thing with raisonnement, so on the one hand, he uses it to say that this is like kind of false. On the other hand, it's generative. Like it does something, it motivates, right? There's something that happens. And it's not like he's just condemning it. So it's almost like a self-deception that one has to engage in. That again produces something else. It produces the slave revolt and morality. It produces this reversal of good and bad and good and evil. It does achieve something.
The way we're talking about it now, it kind of feels like a repressed will to power.
Yeah.
It feels like Nietzsche is one virtue that stunts it. Help act.
Well, it is a will to power. Okay, so let's talk about that. Meaning, for Nietzsche, all life is a will to power. So the simplest life form has a will to power. So will to power is a will to life. And is characterized, we addressed this phrase early on in the course, by self-overcoming. So for something to be alive, it has to master its environment. And in order to master its environment, it first has to master itself. So for something to be alive, it has to be a form of life or a life form. This is the language that he uses, a form of life. What kind of form of life is this? So the question is, what kind of will to power is it? So what kind of form of life, which means what kind of will to power? How is the will to power being exercised, being expressed by this form of life?
In Nietzsche's lexicon, is the will to power always affirmative, or can it be negative? Like, is will to nothingness also a will to power?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. The will to nothingness is the will to power. It's the will to power, like, purified to its essence. So, again, nihilism is a form of the will to power. But it's a form of the will to power that is now demanding a self-overcoming. So it seems to be, it appears in the form of a lack of will to power, but it is itself still a will to power. Right? In comparison to what came before, it seems to be a lack of will to power. And yet, no, that's the entire point, is that it's a new will to power. But as yet, not fully realized.
Short-circuiting its pregnancy.
That would be the last man idea. Because even the last man, it's not like, he doesn't think that we can end up as the last man. And yet, in 2025, it seems like we are that. It does seem like there we are, right? And yet, the story's not over yet, children. The story's not over yet. Meaning, even if we apparently are in the last man condition, that just means that we're in the task of the overman still. Right, so, we talked about this last week, cheerfulness, suffering cheerfully, as opposed to suffering morbidly or morosely. Right, so suffering cheerfully doesn't mean that you don't suffer. It does mean that you suffer. But to do so morosely versus cheerfully means, can we embrace our suffering? And that's the task. So you brought up will to power. I'll just bring in the other corollary term, amor fati. Like, love your fate. Meaning, live your life. Because after all, that's all you've got. Right? So you have to love your fate because otherwise what? You're going to regret your existence? And again, regretting one's existence could be a form of the will to power that is productive, generative, that does lead to a self-overcoming.
Yeah, there's like a natural, right? There's a bit of euphoria in Nietzsche's thought, right? Because it's like he's kind of dismissing something that might actually be the next overcoming, right?
Is he dismissing it? Setting it up as a problem, that's for sure.
Yeah.
What you dismissing?
Start with resentment. Is that what you're?
Yeah, like dismissing this kind of like feeling of inadequacy, I guess, that would serve as a motor for overcoming. By the way, is resentment a neologism or is that an actual French term?
It's a French term, but he's using it. He's giving it its own spin. And by the way, that's also significant that he would use a French term. Is significant because it would mean that somehow the French understand something that the Germans don't. Right, which again goes against their whole romantic self-conception that they have like depth and understanding, whereas the French have a kind of superficial civilization. Mm-hmm.
I've heard this interpretation of resentment in a way that I'm not sure if this contradicts with
No, go ahead.
what you said, and I don't know how like accurate it is to the writing.
Go ahead.
But I've heard it as resentment is when you see yourself as an equal to the person that you're resenting in terms of like who you are, and you're attributing like your condition, like, oh, I'm in an unlucky circumstance, and they have a better circumstance. But if I were there, I could be that. Where resentment is there's something about me that is either undeserving of that circumstance.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
No, that's exactly right.
So then you have to change yourself rather than.
Yeah. So
Just
resentment's
the other person.
very straightforward, right? It's like they have it good, I don't have it so good. Resentment is more like what's wrong with me, and kind of like, but then it is then turned into a kind of it's turned into it is something wrong with me, but it's not something wrong with me, it's something wrong with them. Right? So that's not circumstantial at all. Right? That's more like inherent. So in Nietzsche's view, he thought that ancient peoples just had a circumstantial account of sort of everything. Right? It's just like fortune, misfortune, lucky, unlucky, and it's the will of the gods, it's the fates. Right? So whereas in order to really become human, we do have to acquire some autonomy, right? So we have to, as he puts it, to train animals with the right to make promises. Right? How do you train animals with the right to make promises? Because not everyone has the right to make promises, because not everyone can fulfill a promise. And so, how do you train animals with the right to make promises? Again, the zoomorphism is important. Meaning, we become human in the sense that we have the right to make promises, and promises to others are really promises to oneself. Right? So the right to make promises to others means that you have the ability to make promises to yourself.
There also seems to be a thing caught up in that where before, I guess, when you treat everything circumstantially, you can see yourself separate from your circumstances, but afterwards it feels like it becomes a lot harder to like justify considering yourself, not your circumstances. There being like a weird blending of, I don't know, it's weird because on one hand, you're sort of becoming more human and differentiating yourself from nature, but on the other hand, the result of that is that you become determined by yourself, and then you become your own environment. In a weird sense, I don't have like a point there, but
the aristocrats were favored by the gods, meaning they weren't responsible for their own excellence. They simply were excellent. So to be responsible for yourself already involves a dimensionality that he says we acquired. Right? So like the turning in on oneself, the being responsible for oneself and being responsible to oneself is an added dimensionality to the human that isn't there to begin with. And that's why he describes that original condition as more of an animal existence. Right? Because again, are the aristocrats responsible for themselves? No, they're not. That's the point. Right, so that's where it's just, and it's the other point that I wanted to make, because we jumped into the Middle Ages, and I wanted to just make a basic point, which is like the Prince of Egypt, Moses, let my people go, right? Like what is Pharaohic Egypt? Like what is Egypt? Like it's the beautiful, strong people. And who are the slaves? Yeah, right? And the Prince of Egypt, right, who discovers that he's from the slaves, right, and let my people go. Right? This is the slave revolt in morality. This is that, right, but in the kind of very kind of confused early form of it. Right, so clearly, in like the Pharaohic Egyptian situation, the Egyptians are good and the slaves are bad. Right, but they're the hero of the story for us. Right, for us it's about, let my people go, and then it's about the, God punishing, right, and it's about the, the gods versus God, and who has the power and who doesn't. That whole story is really core to this account that he's giving. Meaning he interprets it as a reversal of values that is the kind of first instance of raisonnement. So it's not, and again, from the aristocratic perspective, from the ruling perspective, they were in a position of superiority because they were favored by the gods. Right? They just were. Right. So it would amount to an overthrow of the natural order to reverse that. Or the divine order. You could look at it that way, the divine order. Let's, before we get into the second essay, let's take a break. Then we'll get into the second essay. All right. Second essay.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about conscience, the connection of free will, and he talks about how guilt specifically is like he does the same like tracing
Etymology,
and how it's connected to debt and like guilt comes from like fear and punishment of that debt and not repaying it. And then he talks a lot about like the cruelty of like older cultures and how like we invented the gods to be a witness to that cruelty and to like so that it's not just pure senseless suffering. And
that's right. So we're suffering, and the gods or demons or something are taking delight in our suffering.
Right.
Right. So we're suffering for a reason. Right. We're being. I think that we talked about this last week with the birth of tragedy. that tragic heroes are heroes, right? Meaning they suffer for their virtues. They're punished for their virtues, in fact. It's because the gods are jealous. The gods are resentful, in this sense, of humans. They're jealous of their own power, and they punish the humans that rival them. Now guilt. Okay, so guilt and conscience, because what he's talking about in the second essay is bad conscience.
Yeah, I didn't answer that.
Yeah, bad conscience is an interesting kind of concept. So there's good conscience and there's bad conscience. So guilt, yes, and now interestingly, he thinks religion comes from guilt. It comes from a sense of debt. So, again, anthropologically or archaeologically, the first form of religion is ancestor worship, meaning who created us, our ancestors, and then the ancestors become kind of gods to us. And we owe them our existence, and therefore we have this debt. And that's the first sense of guilt that we have. We have obligation, filial piety. We have obligation to our ancestors. And, that's pretty straightforward. So, conscience as making a promise to yourself that you have to keep. Including if you make a promise to someone else, you're also making a promise to yourself. So that's like the good conscience. The bad conscience is the guilt that cannot be repaid. It's the promise that can't be kept. So guilt in and of itself is not a problem. Conscience, is an advance in our humanity. It's when we really become human. It comes with it a complication that then a great deal hinges on how we handle it. So he talks about the predator and the prey, the bird of prey, the predator, and that, you can't separate the predator from the act of predation. Right, so the bird of prey has to eat the little lamb, otherwise it won't be a bird of prey. So he says that trying to separate the predator from the act of predation is like trying to separate the flash from the lightning. And yet we do that, right? So part of what comes with conscience is the separation of the doer and the deed. So the doer is not equivalent to the deed. And this is where we have morality as opposed to what he calls the morality of mores. So first we had mores, and now we have morality. So mores are just codes of conduct, like do this, don't do that. Morality, again, a metaphysical object, is like a reason, and a self-given reason. That it's not just a matter of taking this action or that action. It's rather, how does one owe oneself, obligate oneself, promise to oneself, and fulfill that promise. Now this is important because the slave revolt and morality, with Christianity, and again the Roman example of why the Romans became Christians, last week we had the pessimism of the strong, right? We had sort of classical antiquity, the Greeks. Is there a pessimism of the strong? Keep that idea in mind. Not a pessimism of the weak, but a pessimism of the strong. That Christianity was embraced by the Romans out of strength. And again, that's where the key moment of Christianity is when the nobility, the aristocracy, the ruling class, the citizens in Rome embraced Christianity. Meaning they did so from a position of strength. So there's a difference between Christianity as an expression of strength, like he says, turn the other cheek, forgive your enemy, these are aristocratic values. Love your enemy, these are aristocratic values. And that if they're falsely generalized to the weak, then they have a different meaning. Right, so the authentic moment in Christianity, the self-overcoming in Christianity, is the self-overcoming of the noble morality, which isn't really a morality. It's still just the morality of mores, which is a code of conduct. So when the aristocrats who have an honor code, a code of conduct, that is just really an expression of who they are, so they are the strong, and so they act that way. The adoption of Christianity is an authentic self-overcoming.
How is that an absolute state? If someone, an aristocrat didn't act or failed to act in that way,
What would happen? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
They would be killed by the other aristocrats, or they'd kill themselves.
They'd be dishonored.
Yeah, they'd be dishonored. They'd be exiled, which meant killed.
So like this applies to the idea of aristocrat, not a person.
Right. So it's not right. Again, the individual.
It's not a belief, it's beliefs.
Oh yeah. Right. So exactly. So well, I mean, again, the question of this kind of autonomous individual. You have that here. Responsibility, sovereign individual, right? Sovereign individual. So aristocrats are not sovereign individuals the way we think of sovereign individuals. They become sovereign individuals, and again, that's when there are two moments of that. There's Christianization, and then there's the kind of more modern bourgeois subject. So Shakespeare, Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. It's really to act or not to act, that is the question, and it's really about being the prince. So he knows what he's supposed to do, but he also feels at odds with what he's obligated to do as the prince. And so that's a moment of, the tragedy is that he is a sovereign individual, that he does have to choose, and it seems like he's split between what he's expected to do as the prince. To be the prince means to act one way, but he doesn't want to, and so to be himself, he has to not be himself. Right, and he's sort of torn by conscience. And, Nietzsche loves Shakespeare, of course. Because who doesn't? Shakespeare is awesome. But that's authentic, right? Like, that's real. And then you have to live with the consequences of your action, and, that's the sovereign individual. So, of course, one of the things that he's concerned with in the 19th century, remember when he's writing, is denaturalizing the sovereign individual. Meaning, sovereign individual didn't always exist. Came into existence. Came into existence through these self-overcomings, through these transvaluations of value. Right? The human being is not a sovereign individual to begin with, no. Says it takes the training of the animal with the right to make promises, takes blood and more blood. Takes centuries, takes millennia, takes blood and more blood. Right, so it's not just inherent in Homo sapiens. It's not. This quotation that you have,
Yeah.
you want to say something about that?
I thought that it was, I mean, we keep like dancing around communism, and this is him directly addressing.
He's addressing during,
During,
yeah.
And like, it's in the context of like just and unjust, and like he's saying like that only exists in the institution, like it's not inherent, like you said earlier.
By the way, just a side note, so Engels, his most popular, this is Marx's buddy, his most popular writing and really the most popular work of Marxism until the Russian Revolution was Engels's Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which is an extract from a bigger book called Anti-Düring. So there are a lot of parallels between Marxism and Nietzsche in a nutshell. So Nietzsche hated socialism and slash communism, but so did Marx and Engels.
Did Nietzsche read Marx?
No, Marx and Engels were not important enough.
Was he aware of Marx? Did he just chose not to read him, or he was not even aware of him?
Not even aware of him. He was aware of Proudhon. So we talked about Wagner as a Proudhonian socialist and anarchist, a kind of romantic. He's aware of Düring. He's aware of, I don't know if he's even aware of, he might be aware of Lassalle. I don't know if he's aware. He must have been aware of Lassalle, Ferdinand Lassalle. But no, Marx and Engels are a little obscure. They're the party of two for a long time. I mean, they have their acolytes, but then their acolytes only get a mass following later. Like after Marx's death, that's for sure.
When would you say they're truly brought out of obscurity? When would you say that they're truly brought out of obscurity?
In the 1880s. 1870, I mean, in other words, other socialists certainly knew about Marx and Engels because of the First International, but did the wider world? And Marx also would have been more, first of all, he's in exile. He and Engels are in England, they're in France, and they're in England. And so they have more direct influence among the emigre community. And maybe they're more well known in the English-speaking world, actually. It's a strange scene in the 1800s. The socialist communist world is a lot more heterogeneous. There are a lot of rivalries and whatnot. I mean, Nietzsche was aware of the Paris Commune, but would he be, because the Paris Commune was dominated by other ideological tendencies, not Marxism. So, yeah. But anyway, the point being, Düring is his case, and that was also true of Engels.
Okay.
This is the socialism that he can't stand, right? Right, a legal order thought of as sovereign and universal, not as a means in the struggle between power complexes, but as a means of preventing all struggle in general, perhaps after the communistic cliche of Düring, that every will must consider every other will its equal, would be a principle hostile to life, an agent of the dissolution and destruction of man, an attempt to assassinate the future of man, a sign of weariness, a secret path to nothingness. That's true. That is true. That's not the Marxist goal. Is not some kind of radical egalitarianism that destroys everything. No. All right, third essay. What is the meaning of ascetic ideals? So asceticism, self-denial. Right. So this is where he brings in the tripartite division that I mentioned. So where he starts with the art versus theoretical man. Now it's art, science, philosophy. So he says, what do aesthetic ideals mean to the scientist? What do they mean to the artist? And then what do they mean to the philosopher? And he really is zeroing in on what aesthetic ideals mean to the philosopher. Meaning, what is the specific will to power of the philosopher? And how is it descended from, again, the priestly caste? So artists engage in asceticism only insofar as they make choices, aesthetic choices about what to do, what not to do. So they don't, allow themselves to do everything all the time. So it's very different. He says, I think that he says that it means almost nothing to the artist, the aesthetic ideal, meaning it has no inherent meaning. Let's look at the beginning of the third essay. Sorry, this PDF doesn't have a table of contents. Unconcerned, mocking, violent, thus wisdom wants us. She is a woman and always loves only a warrior. What is the meaning of aesthetic ideals? In the case of artists, they mean nothing or too many things. In the case of philosophers and scholars, something like a sense and instinct for the most favorable preconditions of higher spirituality. In the case of women, at best one more seductive charm, a touch of morbidezza in fair flesh, the angelic look of a plump, pretty animal. In the case of the physiologically deformed and deranged, the majority of mortals, an attempt to see themselves as too good for this world, a saintly form of debauch, their chief weapon in the struggle against slow pain and boredom. In the case of priests, the distinctive priestly faith, their best instrument of power, also the supreme license for power. In the case of saints, finally, a pretext for hibernation, their novissima gloria cupido, their repose in nothingness, God, their form of madness. That the aesthetic ideal has meant so many things to man, however, is an expression of the basic fact of the human will, its horror vacui. It needs a goal, and it will rather will nothingness than not will. Am I understood? Have I been understood? Not at all, my dear sir. Then let us start again from the beginning. What is the meaning of aesthetic ideals? We're to take an individual case that I have most often been asked about, and this is what we'll talk about next week. What does it mean, for example, when an artist like Richard Wagner pays homage to chastity in his old age? In a certain sense, to be sure, he had always done this, but only in the very end in an ascetic sense. What is the meaning of this change of sense, this radical reversal of sense? And that is what it was. Wagner leaped over into his opposite. What does it mean when an artist leaps over into his opposite? Here, if we are disposed to pause a moment at this question, we are at once reminded of what was perhaps the finest, strongest, happiest, most courageous period in Wagner's life, the period during which he was deeply concerned with the idea of Luther's wedding. Who knows upon what chance events it depended that instead of this wedding music we possess today, the Meistersinger, and how much of the former perhaps still echoes in the latter, but there can be no doubt that Luther's wedding would have involved a praise of chastity and also a praise of sensuality, to be sure, and this would have seemed to be quite in order, quite Wagnerian. For there is no necessary antithesis between chastity and sensuality. Every good marriage, every genuine love affair transcends this antithesis. Wagner would have done well, I think, to have brought this pleasant fact home once more to his Germans by means of a bold and beautiful Luther comedy. For there would have always been, and still are, many slanders of sensuality among the Germans. And perhaps Luther performed no greater service than to have had the courage of his sensuality. In those days it was called, delicately enough, evangelical freedom. But even in those cases, in which this antithesis between chastity and sensuality really exists, there is fortunately no need for it to be a tragic antithesis. At least this holds good for all those well-constituted, joyful mortals who are far from regarding their unstable equilibrium between animal and angel as necessarily an argument against existence. The subtlest and brightest among them have even found in it, like Goethe and Hafiz, one more stimulus to life. It is precisely such contradictions that seduce one into existence. On the other hand, seduce one to existence. On the other hand, it is only too clear that when swine who have come to grief are finally induced to worship chastity, and there are such swine, they will see and worship in it only their antithesis, the antithesis of failed swine, and one can imagine with what tragic zeal and grunting they will do so. That embarrassing and superfluous antithesis which Richard Wagner at the end of his life unquestionably intended to set to music and put upon the stage. But why? As one might reasonably ask, for what were swine to him, and what are they to us? Okay, I went through that only because we're doing Parsifal next week. So next week we're doing Parsifal by Wagner, and we're doing Bizet's Carmen. And there are two readings for next week. There's the Case of Wagner, and there's Adorno's Fantasia Sopra Carmen. And it didn't take volunteers, I realize. Okay, that's one. Do I have a second Case of Wagner? Wagner and Bizet. Do you guys know Carmen? Is Carmen still popular? No? Okay, so there's a selection of music that is included on Canvas. You'll see that there are MP3s uploaded. And also we will look in class at some selections from both Carmen and Parsifal. Second volunteer? Okay, great, excellent, cool. All right, so so his discussion here is relevant to what we'll be discussing next week. So maybe revisit that if you need to in the context of the Case of Wagner. Let's go back to the notes.
Yeah, I was definitely not as, like, I didn't understand this as much. But I was confused because it seemed like he was very critical of sex and like marriage, and was, but also at the same time seemed to be arguing the opposite position. I don't know. And like, because he was like praising like Wagner was like chaste in his life, right? And like that, I don't know. But he talks a lot about the like self-torture and fearing reference of the Brahmin civilization, and how like that goes back also to the like cheerful suffering, and like it's not necessarily a bad thing. But then like the main thing is like the philosopher as ascetic priest.
So avoidance of suffering is a symptom, right? So it's not like, oh, we've ended up in nihilism because we avoid suffering. It's not due to avoiding suffering. Rather, we avoid suffering because of this nihilism that we've landed in. So it's not what we might initially think. Right, so in the way that he's describing it, the avoiding of suffering is a late phenomenon. It's a modern, very 19th century phenomenon. So I mentioned utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, the happiness principle, right? And that involves a definition of the good that would appear to be avoidance of suffering. Right, but that, again, for him is a symptom. So people didn't avoid suffering until a fairly late stage. And why is that? Because suffering was involved in how life had meaning, because suffering didn't take meaning away from life, it gave meaning to life. So then it's a question of how we suffered, how we experienced our own suffering, which really speaks to how we experience our own life, our own existence. Right? That's why the avoidance of suffering would be a symptom, because really it has to do with what he calls weariness of life. So when you're weary of life, you avoid suffering. Now, I mentioned that the will to power is his definition of life. Every form of life has a will to power. Every form of life is a form of the will to power. So, a weariness with life is a weariness with a form of life. It's specific to a certain form of life. And that's really what comes out in the third essay, is how he's characterizing the modern form of life, the 19th century form of life. That's where the quote is pertinent. So we must count the ascetic priest as the predestined savior, shepherd, and advocate of the sick herd. Only thus can we understand his tremendous historical mission. Dominion over the suffering is his kingdom. That is where his instinct directs him. Here he possesses his distinctive art, his mastery, his kind of happiness. Okay, so mastery. Let's talk about this. So mastery is self-mastery, first and foremost. So I mentioned that the will to power is a form of life, or it's how he understands any form of life. The will to power is a will to mastery, a will to self-mastery. So for any form of life, what's necessary is the ability to master the environment, but to be able to master the environment means the ability to master oneself. All right, so it's to have power over oneself. It's self-mastery. But that takes different forms. And because it takes different forms, there are different forms of life. And because there are different forms of life, there are different experiences of suffering. Now, the Brahmanism, okay, so one of his diagnoses of modern European civilization is that it's a kind of post-Christian Buddhism. It's a kind of weird European Buddhism, so kind of misbegotten or kind of an abomination. So why? Because who was Buddha? Prince. He's a prince. He was a warrior. Right. So, like, you know, your kind of average bourgeois, whatever, embracing Buddhism is like the opposite of Buddhism. It's not the same as Buddhism at all. So it's more of an expression of the weariness with life than it is an expression of the will to life. So Buddhism was a transcending of Brahmanism. And again, understood as asceticism. And again, denying yourself things. Right, so you can't deny yourself something that you don't have. You can only deny yourself something that you do have. Now you mentioned here the philosopher is descended from, is a variation on the ascetic priest. on a kind of priestly asceticism, but the priestly asceticism turned towards a specific goal. Right, so it's a form of priestly asceticism in service of what? Truth, knowledge. So it's a specific kind of value that the asceticism is being pursued in the name of. Because that wasn't actually what priestly asceticism was about. Priestly asceticism is not about truth and knowledge. But the philosophers is. Katerina, you have some notes on asceticism.
Yeah. So it offers a meaning for suffering, especially by way of religion. But the search for a reason for suffering and the lack of the reason is more insufferable than the suffering when you have a reason for suffering itself. But he says all great things bring about their own destruction through an act of self-overcoming, even our ideas, and talks about how the morals of Christianity kind of became our reasons to no longer have faith in Christianity as our way to run the world, which seemingly got us into this whole nihilistic reality. Then I was thinking about relating that to what now. And I mean, I have like a vague reason for my life, like both to actually enjoy it and to make it possible for more people to enjoy it.
It's Epicureanism.
Oh, apparently.
Not bad.
But
I'm
at
in
the same
favor.
time, perhaps, and you know, any suffering in the way of that, like, can be medicated, but it may not, I don't know if it has the same worth as, say, Christian asceticism.
Right.
As a way to pacify suffering. But I also don't know if it has to. Like, I'm not sure if that coexists with contemporary nihilism or can be a salve for it.
Right, so I mentioned the kind of false Buddhism, but there's also the false Christianity. Right, so there's the kind of authentic Christianity and then there's the false Christianity. Now, what he thinks happened with the Protestant Reformation is that there was a kind of self-overcoming of Christianity, but then, you know, has yielded another problem. Right, so the generalization of Christianity was its ultimate triumph, but also its ultimate sort of termination. And then that's what he sees playing out in his time. And he sees now Christianity as an avoidance of the problem of Christianity. Right, so that's where it becomes false. In other words, it doesn't face the task of self-overcoming. It just sort of tries to deal with the problem of Christianity with more Christianity. So it's a kind of it's a implicit nihilism that denies itself. Now, here's a point. I think that we talked about this. I'm trying to recall about the fate of art. We talked about that last time, about Aristotle as a psychologist and maybe not really a philosopher, and art like providing therapy. That Aristotle's account of catharsis, of tragedy, was like the therapeutic effect of art. And that's really the sign of this crisis for Nietzsche, is that European civilization has become a simultaneous, and this is a very Foucauldian idea, simultaneous factory, barracks, prison, hospital, where the sick minister to the sick, basically. Right, so, and he says that there's something appropriate about repetitive labor to modern humanity. Right, so this is his characterization of capitalism, and that is what the Protestant work ethic has come to, right? So work for its own sake seems to be the result of what was an overcoming of traditional Christianity that didn't have the work ethic. So art as therapy, he doesn't like that. Philosophy as therapy, he also doesn't like that. Meaning philosophy similarly is in a position, even science, like the point of science, seems to be therapeutic. So that, the idea that objective knowledge is equivalent to eliminating suffering. Right, so that sort of association that we have, which is actually not at all true to science, meaning scientific discovery brings new suffering. It doesn't put an end to suffering, it creates new forms of suffering. But that we can't be honest with ourselves about that. That's really the issue for Nietzsche, is that we can't face the fact that we're creating new forms of suffering by trying to avoid suffering or try to overcome suffering through a kind of therapy. Right, so both, or all three, art, philosophy, and science, all seem to be bound up in this problem, which is to say, what is their actual purpose? So if science has been perverted into a kind of, knowledge, equivalence of knowledge and an end to suffering, and art has been reduced to a kind of therapeutic exercise, then philosophy is in this kind of curious position where it is coming up against the kind of nihilism, the question of meaninglessness, most directly because of its concern with truth, the truth of truth. And yet it's also avoiding that. Right? So philosophy is, clearly in a crisis, and that's why he thinks that philosophers have to examine themselves and realize the truth of their own motivations as philosophers, and that's where you get the kind of psychology-philosophy nexus. Because it's appropriate to what philosophy has become. It's become a kind of consolation, to use a term from actually the late Roman era, the consolation of philosophy, Boethius. So that we can't find meaning in life, but we can find meaning in philosophy, right? Which actually doesn't make any sense. The only way it could make sense is to think of the peculiar form of life of the philosopher. I want to remind us of Hegel, which is the idea that we've arrived at a philosophical society, a philosophical reality, a philosophical way of life. Because that's also an issue of Nietzsche. So in the preface, he says, we don't know ourselves, we men of knowledge. How could we? Because we haven't even sought ourselves. And I said that that's in two different respects. There are the philosophers as a specialized discipline, but then there's the question of this society valuing knowledge above all. In other words, this society is a philosophical society, that knowledge is the cure-all. The idea is that if only we had more knowledge, then we would solve all the reasons for our suffering. All right, so that's why he can make the claim that he does, that the particular case of philosophy is actually getting at the totality and has actually subordinated art and science to itself. All right, so art and science have their own purposes, but they've both been shackled to philosophy as the great adjudicator of meaning. And yet philosophy has avoided itself, we might say. And that's what requires a psychological investigation. So again, on truth and light in an extra moral sense, where does this will to truth come from? Where does this will to knowledge come from? And what does it mean for us to live in a civilization that's willing to put truth and knowledge above life? And yet that is our form of life. So it's not actually putting truth and knowledge above life, because that is the form of life that we're in. So at the very end, and then we'll adjourn for the day. Final paragraph here. Apart from the aesthetic ideal, man, the human animal, had no meaning so far. His existence on earth contained no goal. Why man at all? Was a question without an answer. The will for man and earth was lacking. Behind every great human destiny there sounded as a refrain, a yet greater in vain. This is precisely what the aesthetic ideal means, that something was lacking, that man was surrounded by a fearful void. He did not know how to justify, to account for, to affirm himself. He suffered from the problem of his meaning. He also suffered otherwise. He was in the main a sickly animal, but his problem was not suffering itself, but that there was no answer to the crying question, why do I suffer? Man, the bravest of animals, and the one most accustomed to suffering, does not repudiate suffering as such. He desires it. He even seeks it out, provided he has shown a meaning for it, a purpose for suffering. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far, and the aesthetic ideal offered man meaning. It was the only meaning offered so far. Any meaning is better than none at all. The aesthetic ideal was in every sense the faute de mieux par excellence so far. In it, suffering was interpreted. The tremendous void seemed to have been filled. The door was closed to any kind of suicidal nihilism. This interpretation, there is no doubt of it, brought fresh suffering with it, deeper, more inward, more poisonous, more life-destructive suffering. It placed all suffering under the perspective of guilt. But all this notwithstanding, man was saved thereby. He possessed a meaning. He was henceforth no longer like a leaf in the wind, a plaything of nonsense, the senseless. He could now will something, no matter at first to what end, why, with what he willed. The will itself was saved. We can no longer conceal from ourselves what is expressed by all this willing, or all that willing, which has taken its direction from the aesthetic ideal. This hatred of the human, and even more of the animal, and more still of the material. This horror of the senses, of reason itself, this fear of happiness and beauty, this longing to get away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, wishing, from longing itself. All this means, let us dare to grasp it, a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life. But it is and remains a will. And to repeat in conclusion what I said at the beginning, man would rather will nothingness than not will. We'll come back to the dispute with Kant, the Stendhal versus Kant, right? So the disinterested beauty versus the promise of happiness. Next time. It will be relevant when we do Carmen and Parsifal.